Well, good morning. My name is Micah Chandler. For those of you I haven't met yet, I know that's a lot of you probably. But for those of you I already know, I'm very glad to see you here, very glad to be worshiping with you and excited about it. I've started working with Shane this summer, for those of you who haven't known, so I'm going to be working with him on preaching. Today is sort of a special case, though, because he's gone, praying for his recovery, of course, and Phil's also out of town. So I can basically just say whatever I want today with no consequences. I'm free of the reins at this point, so no, just kidding. Definitely really praying for Shane's speedy recovery. It's been great to start working with him. So this summer, a few weeks ago, I had the opportunity to travel to Italy with the chorus from my college, and we were able to go Florence and Rome, and it was an incredible trip. I was able to see a ton of art and architecture and history, and it was just an incredible experience. One thing that struck me while I was there was all the basilicas that we got to visit. And if you don't know what a basilica is, which I didn't really either when I went to Italy, it's basically just a church or a cathedral that has historical relics in it. So we got to see a bunch of those. We got to sing and see a bunch of those dating back 500, 600, some 1,000 years. And the detail and beauty and the sculpting and the painting and the architecture is just, it's really overwhelming and breathtaking in every single one. Most notably, we had the opportunity to visit St. Peter's Basilica in Vatican City in Rome. It was really cool. That's a picture of it, very bad picture I took. You can't really see the scale of it. You can sort of see the people's heads at the bottom, but the scale is just absolutely massive. And there's some alcoves that keep going out, and it's just so extensive. You can see the detail, and the craftsmanship is just incredible. And it contains sculptures from Michelangelo and Donatello, some of the most influential sculptors and artists of the Renaissance, and countless others. So it was just incredible to see. That's closer up to the altar. So you can see the detail and just the amount of money and time that was poured into this is incredible. And this is another one of the basilicas that we got to sing in. And I just thought the ceiling was incredible. And just every one of these, you walk in, and it's a very moving experience. You see all these paintings of Jesus and Bible characters and stories. There's something undoubtedly moving about being in a place like that. You can't deny that. And it also struck me, however, that the majority of the people there, including myself, were not there to worship. They were there to see the building and the beauty and scale of the building. So I started to wonder why that was. That caught my attention. And I really started to wonder about beauty and what the purpose of it is anyway. And that's a big question. Whether or not the original designers of these basilicas, whether their motivation was to just genuinely create a place of worship or to create a visual spectacle as something really impressive to see, I don't know which one was their motivation. But all I know now is that the attraction of these basilicas is not in their inward beauty, it's in their outward beauty. People go to these basilicas to see the basilica, to see the building. And something about that just doesn't seem complete. It doesn't seem right. There must be something more important about these places than just the fact that they're beautiful. Why were they built to be so beautiful? Why am I moved when I experience a place like this? And why is this beauty being associated with religion in the first place? These are some of the questions that just started swirling around my head, as they might swirl around your head, if any of you have been there. And so I'd like to discuss these questions with you this morning. And seeing this kind of beauty and scale and wealth in a place of worship was very foreign to me. Even though, this is a pretty nice building here, right? You got the LED lights and everything, and the monitor in the back. So don't get me wrong, it's a nice building. But it's just different. It's just different when you go over there. It's just a different type of building. So, don't get me wrong. But so it was very foreign to me to be in a place of worship that was designed to look like that. But looking at it made me think of another location in the Old Testament that was made for worship, and that was the temple. And it's described as looking somewhat similar to these basilicas, very ornate and very beautiful. So this morning, I'd like to discuss the beauty of God's temple. The temple was extremely ornate, decorated with gold, art, all kinds of detail. It was extremely impressive, like a lot of those basilicas. But there was a clear purpose and design behind the art in the temple, which I think gives us some insight into why beauty is often paired with God. Anyway, the first point I'd like us to consider is that the beauty of the temple pointed to God. The beauty of the temple was meant to point the observer to the fact that God dwelled in the temple. If you'd like to turn to 1 Kings chapter 6, 1 Kings chapter 6, there's a description of the design and construction of Solomon's temple. And I'd like us to take a look at some things that are emphasized there. We're just going to read a brief passage talking about the construction of Solomon's temple. 1 Kings chapter 6, starting in verse 23. Verse 23, it says, "In the inner sanctuary he made 2 cherubim of olive wood, each 10 cubits high. 5 cubits with the length of one wing of the cherub, and 5 cubits the length of the other wing of the cherub. It was 10 cubits from the tip of one wing to the tip of the other. The other cherub also measured 10 cubits. Both cherubim had the same measure and the same form. The height of one cherub was 10 cubits, and so was that of the other cherub. He put the cherubim in the innermost part of the house, and the wings of the cherubim were spread out so that a wing of one touched the one wall, and a wing of the other cherub touched the other wall. Their other wings touched each other in the middle of the house, and he overlaid the cherubim with gold. Around all the walls of the house he carved engraved figures of cherubim and palm trees and open flowers in the inner and outer rooms. The floor of the house he overlaid with gold in the inner and outer rooms. For the entrance to the inner sanctuary he made doors of olive wood. The lintel and the doorposts were 5-sided. He covered 2 doors of olive wood with carvings of cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers. He overlaid them with gold and spread gold on the cherubim and on the palm trees." So this is just a very brief passage describing the construction and design of Solomon's temple. So it doesn't include every detail of the temple, but it contains a couple details that I'd like to point out this morning. Besides the vastness and wealth involved in the temple, what imagery is included in the design of the temple? Well, we heard a lot of cherubim come up. He said that like 10, 20 times, cherubim. So that's clearly a very important detail, and from the scale of it, they're huge. So we have the imagery of cherubim, and we have plants, open flowers, olive wood, palm tree. And while this imagery is probably a testament to the natural beauty of God's creation too, I think it also has some deeper meanings. What other place in the Bible do we associate with cherubim and plants? It's the Garden of Eden. And so it seems that in the design of the temple, the designers were intentionally directing the observer's mind back to the Garden of Eden. Why is that? Well, this garden imagery suggests something to us, I think, about the purpose of the temple in the first place. The garden wasn't only the first dwelling place of man alone, it was the place where God dwelled with man in the garden. God was with man in the garden. In fact, this is part of why after Adam and Eve sinned, they were cast out of the garden because they couldn't be in God's presence anymore. The Garden of Eden imagery in the temple was meant to emphasize the temple's purpose, which is to be a place where man can draw near to the presence of God. Just like in the Garden of Eden, God was with man in the temple. And the beauty of the temple was meant to emphasize that, and they intentionally put imagery from the garden to emphasize that point, that the temple was a place you went to be with God. David mentions this idea in Psalm 27, talking about the house of God. Psalm 27 in verse 4, David says, "One thing I have asked of the Lord that I will seek after, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord and to inquire in his temple." So David talks about the temple and the house of the Lord as a place to see the Lord. And even though this temple we've been talking about, Solomon's temple, wasn't around when David wrote this psalm, it gives us insight to what the purpose of a temple is in the first place. The temple is a place where man goes to be with God. You go to a temple to see God, not to see the temple, which suggests that any beauty the temple may have, any physical beauty, points to that purpose. It is not beautiful for its own sake. The physical beauty is included to serve the fuller purpose of the temple, which is to be the dwelling place of God's Spirit. The purpose of the art in the temple was not so people would come and say, "Wow, those cherubim are gorgeous. You know, those cherubim are huge. And, oh, wow, these flowers, these pictures of flowers and carvings of flowers, they're so pretty." They were meant to direct you to the thought that I'm here to be with God, and I'm here to see God. And being in some of those basilicas, surrounded by sculptures and paintings of Bible stories, was really moving. And art like that, especially depicting biblical things, should naturally lead us to think about God and the Bible. I'm not sure if that was the intention of the painters of those paintings I saw over there. It was most certainly the intention of the design of the temple. The art in the temple was meant to emphasize the true purpose of the temple. We understand the ideas of inner and outer beauty. That's a concept that we sort of understand. You may have married someone or be dating someone that you think is very outwardly beautiful, hopefully. And hopefully even more so, you're dating them or you're married to them because you're very attracted to their inward beauty, their character, their personality, and so on. Understanding the difference between these two beauties, we also understand it can be really hard to put the focus on the outward beauty because it's what we immediately see and experience. That's a trap I fall into. That's a trap you may have fallen into too. And it's a trap that the Israelites ended up making with the temple. We see this in Jeremiah 7, where our scripture reading came from, that was read so well. Jeremiah 7, I'll start in verse 1. Jeremiah 7 is an illustration of the trap that we can fall into, that we miss where outward beauty points us. We miss the message of outward beauty. Jeremiah 7, starting in verse 1. The word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord: stand in the gate of the Lord's house and proclaim there this word, and say, hear the word of the Lord, all you men of Judah, and enter these gates to worship the Lord. Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, amend your ways and your deeds, and I will let you dwell in this place. Do not trust in these deceptive words. This is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. For if you truly amend your ways and your deeds, if you truly execute justice one with another, if you do not oppress the sojourner and fatherless or the widow or shed innocent blood in this place, and if you do not go after other gods to your own harm, then I will let you dwell in this place, in the land that I gave of old to your fathers forever. Behold, you trust in deceptive words to no avail. Will you steal, murder, commit adultery, swear falsely, make offerings to Baal, and go after other gods that you have not known, and then come stand before me in this house, which is called by my name, and say, we are delivered, only to go on doing all these abominations? Has this house, which is called by my name, become a den of robbers in your eyes? Behold, I myself have seen it, declares the Lord. Go now to my place that was in Shiloh, where I made my name dwell at first, and see what I did to it because of the evil of my people Israel. And now, because you have done all these things, declares the Lord, and when I spoke to you persistently, you did not listen, and when I called you, you did not answer. Therefore, I will do to the house that is called by my name, and in which you trust, and to the place that I gave to you and to your fathers, as I did to Shiloh. And I will cast you out of my sight, as I cast out all your kinsmen, all the offspring of Ephraim. So we see in this passage that the Israelites had a misunderstanding of the nature of the temple. They were sort of using it as a good luck charm. They were very confident in their security in the temple, and yet they were living actively disobedient lives to God. There was a disconnect in understanding that the temple was only great because God dwelled there, and understanding that if God dwells there, you have to live obediently to God if you want to put security in it. Living lives that were not in line with God's commandments also meant that their security in the temple was gone. God was teaching them that the power of the temple was not in its physical attributes or beauty or magnificence. The temple was not something to brag about because of how beautiful or expensive it was. The power of the temple came from God's presence there. God says in this passage that if they would change the way they're acting, then he would bring them into the house. He would let them dwell there. He tells us that obedience precedes our security in the temple. That's what he tells the Israelites. But they were actively disobeying, and it's for this reason God says he's going to destroy the temple. God says, okay, you think you're great because you have this great temple, it's expensive, and you put your trust in that? Well, I'm going to show you that when you take me out of the equation, it's nothing more than just a building that can be reduced to rubble. If you take God out of the temple is just a building, and it's subject to destruction. And this is a very easy trap to fall into. It's very easy to focus on the outward beauty and not the inward beauty. So easy, in fact, that it was still a problem when we come to the New Testament in regards to the temple. If you look at Luke chapter 19, starting in verse 45. Luke 19:45. And he entered the temple, this is talking about Jesus, and began to drive out those who sold, saying to them, it is written, my house shall be a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of robbers. We can see that Jesus refers to the money changers making the temple a den of robbers. He's calling back to Jeremiah 7. That's exactly what Jeremiah prophesied against the Israelites. You've made my house a den of robbers. And the same problem is true in the New Testament. the way they were conducting their lives and their use of the temple didn't fit together, and it should have. And Jesus is calling them out for that. And he expounds on this over in chapter 21 and verse 5. Chapter 21 and verse 5, he says, "And while some were speaking of the temple, how it was adorned with noble stones and offerings, he said, 'As for these things that you see, the days will come when there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down.'" So this is also reminiscent of Jeremiah 7. This passage is, "The men were admiring the stones in the temple." My translation says noble stones. Your translation may say beautiful stones. That's often what that word is translated to, beautiful. They were admiring the physical beauty of the temple, and Jesus' response to that is, "I'm going to tear it down." Jesus was reminding them that the true beauty of the temple was not in its physical appearance. The beauty of the temple was not in the stones and the offerings. Now this was Herod's temple, of course, so can't pretend like it was built with exactly the same purpose and intention as Solomon's temple. It was probably built more to be a physical wonder and to appease the Jews, whereas opposed to Solomon's temple was probably built with more genuine intention. But nevertheless, the temple was still supposed to be used as a place for the Jews to draw near to God. And that might emphasize Jesus' point even more, the fact that this temple might not have been built with the same intention, because he's saying, you take God out of the temple and it's just a building. These stones are going to be thrown down. So it might bring that point home even more. So both of these passages are really sad passages. The beauty of God, the inner beauty of the temple, is being neglected for the outer beauty, which is less important, and it's supposed to lead back to God's beauty anyway. So it's a really sad passage. The people in these stories are missing that just as we do sometimes, and God's way of reminding them is scary and unpleasant. It's harsh destruction of the temple. But the gospel gives us comfort concerning this idea. God will not leave us without a temple. Jesus suggests an alternate idea for the temple in the book of John and in chapter 2. John chapter 2, and this is right after the cleansing of the temple story that we just read in Luke 19. John chapter 2, starting in verse 18. "So the Jews said to him, 'What sign do you show us for these things?' Jesus answered them, 'Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up.' The Jews said, 'It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you will raise it up in 3 days?' But he was speaking about the temple of his body. When therefore he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken." So Jesus declares that his body is a temple. His body is the dwelling place of God's Spirit. And further, Jesus himself prophesies destruction against this temple, against his own body. Jesus says this temple will be torn down. But there's a difference in this temple and the destruction of the previous temples. The difference in this temple and the previous temples is that this temple will overcome its destruction. The previous temples could do nothing to stop their destruction from God. Jesus overcomes the destruction of his body as a temple because he is God. He says, "Tear down this temple and I will raise it back up in 3 days." This temple is not subject to destruction. It overcomes destruction. Isaiah gives us more insight into Jesus' body as a temple. Starting in Isaiah chapter 52, there's a description of Jesus. Isaiah 52, starting in verse 13. "Behold, my servant shall act wisely. He shall be high and lifted up and shall be exalted. As many were astonished at you, his appearance was so marred beyond human semblance, and his form beyond that of children of mankind. So shall he sprinkle many nations. Kings shall shut their mouths because of him. For that which has not been told them they see, and that which they have not heard they understand. Who has believed what he has heard from us? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he grew up before him like a young plant, like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and as one from whom men hide their faces he was despised, and we esteemed him not." So Isaiah reveals here that the temple of Jesus' body was not beautiful or noble or impressive or desirable in appearance. Quite the opposite. Isaiah describes Jesus as marred, as having no form or majesty, no beauty, despised, rejected, one from whom men hide their faces. This is not an aesthetic temple at all. Now, Isaiah doesn't describe Jesus like this to turn us away from Jesus. Isaiah describes Jesus like this to show us where the real beauty of Jesus laid. Jesus' lowly appearance shows us that the primary beauty of a temple is not the outward beauty, it's the inward. And Isaiah goes on to tell us where the beauty of Jesus really lied in verse 4. Verse 4 of Isaiah 53, Isaiah says, "Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted." And Isaiah goes on to describe more of what Jesus has done. Jesus' beauty was not in appearance. He didn't have any appearance. The beauty of Jesus as a temple was in the actions of Jesus. That is why God's Spirit dwelled there, not because Jesus was anything to look at, but because of what he did and who he was. God's Spirit dwelled in him, and yet we esteemed him not, stricken by God and afflicted. The same was true for the physical temple in Jeremiah 7. The true beauty was not in its physical appearance, but in the fact that God's Spirit dwelled there. But the people's sinful actions made their security in the temple go away, and the very opposite of Jesus, whose actions granted him the role and title of temple. His body was the dwelling place of God. Later in the New Testament, Paul talks more about the idea of a temple in the context of the gospel. In Ephesians chapter 2, he talks about this. Ephesians chapter 2, starting in verse 19, Paul says, "So then you are no longer strangers and aliens, but you are fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God, built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Christ Jesus himself being the cornerstone, in whom the whole structure being joined together grows into a holy temple in the Lord. In him you are also being built together into a dwelling place for God by the Spirit." Paul tells us that because Jesus' body overcame destruction, we have been granted the role of temple. We are being built into a temple because of the grace we've been given through the sacrifice of Jesus. God's Spirit is being made to dwell in us, those who believe. And he makes the same point in 1 Corinthians 3:16. "Do you not know that you are a temple of God and that the Spirit of God dwells in you?" The magnitude of that gift of grace cannot be overstated or emphasized or overemphasized. Through grace, we have been made into a dwelling place for God's Spirit, a temple. And if we understand the role of the temple in the first place, we understand that the beauty of any temple is meant to point it to the fact that God's Spirit dwells there. And that would suggest that any beauty that we have, whether outward or inward, should point us back to God. As temples, any beauty we reflect, or we have, reflects God's beauty. That's significant, that's overwhelming. That's an overwhelming message when we understand that looking at each other and looking at ourselves points us back to God. That's really overwhelming, and it's because of the grace of Jesus' sacrifice of his body as a temple. Think about Solomon's temple and the money and time and detail that was poured into that as a place to draw close to God. It was a big deal to come into God's presence, and now through the grace of the gospel, God's Spirit dwells in us as temples, not because of anything we've done, but through grace. And further, that commands obedience and faith to God, just like it did in the Old Testament. Jeremiah prophesied the destruction of Solomon's temple because the people were so secure in it, despite their disobedience. And the same is true for us. It should be a warning to us about the sanctity of what we've been made into, the sanctity and importance of being made into a temple. Being a temple is no trivial matter. Paul goes on to tell us about this. Ephesians chapter 4, just a couple chapters later, Ephesians chapter 4, starting in verse 1, Paul says, "I therefore, a prisoner for the Lord, urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing one another in love, eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. There is one body and one Spirit, just as you were called to the one hope that belongs to your call. One Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all. But grace was given to each one of us according to the measure of Christ's gift." Paul reminds us here that there's a certain manner of living that naturally follows becoming a dwelling place for God's Spirit. There is a worthy manner in which we should walk, a life of faith and a life of obedience and a life of love. And he emphasizes the unity of it all as well. We are all being built into a temple, most importantly, with Christ as the cornerstone, on the foundation of the apostles and prophets. There's no room for pride or selfishness. We are united into a dwelling place for God with Christ. That's a beautiful and overwhelming image. Beauty has always been associated with the temple, but the real beauty of the temple is oftentimes what people tended to focus on the least, what I might tend to focus on the least when I deal with my brothers and sisters. Just like the Israelites, the beauty I often primarily focus on is the outward, while the true beauty lies in the fact that my brothers and sisters have been made and are being built into a dwelling place for God's Spirit with me and with Christ. That's beautiful. And their outward and inward beauty is supposed to point me to that fact anyway. We've been made in God's image. Everything about my brothers and sisters is supposed to point me back to God and his creation and his beauty. And as outwardly beautiful as Solomon's or Herod's temple was, and as inwardly beautiful as Christ's body as a temple was, and as beautiful as the unity God has given us all by building us into a temple is, even all that beauty is still meant to point us somewhere else. The temples that the Israelites used in the Old and New Testaments were not the final temples. The temple that God has built us into here and allowed our bodies to become a dwelling place for God, that is not the final temple. The final temple is yet to come. And the previous and current temples point us toward the final temple. There's a problem with all of these previous temples, and that is that there is an obstruction between man and the presence of God. In Solomon's temple, only a very few select people could enter into God's presence, and only at certain times. It was very selective. And even then, the presence of God in the temple, in the most holy place, was not the true fullness of his glory and being. At least not God as he would be perfectly and fully experienced in all his glory. And I think we can comprehend that. No human being could endure the full glory of God because of our physical limitations and our physical body that we experience this world in. But that is an experience to come. That has been promised us, and that experience is one we should look forward to. That is what us being built into a temple now points to. God reveals to us the final temple in Revelation 21, starting in verse 15. God talks about the final temple. Revelation chapter 21. I'll start in verse 22, actually. Revelation 21, verse 22. And I saw no temple in the city, for its temple is the Lord God, the Almighty, and the Lamb. And the city has no need of sun or moon to shine on it, for the glory of God gives its light, and its lamp is the Lamb. There's a difference in this city and the most holy place, and it's a beautiful difference. God is no longer obstructed. God no longer dwells in a physical temple. God himself and the Lamb are the temple, and no obstruction exists between God and us. And this makes sense if we understand what the purpose of the temple has been all along, which, like we've discussed, was to be a place where man could draw near to God and be with God. The ultimate temple is God himself and the Lamb in heaven, unobstructed and in his full glory and majesty. That is what the beauty of Solomon's temple pointed toward. That is what the beauty of Jesus' sacrifice of his temple, his body as a temple, and his victory over death pointed toward. And that is what we, who through grace are being built into a temple for God, that is what we point toward. The true temple has always been God himself, and the Lamb and every other temple God has given us throughout history has been meant to point us toward the eventual fulfillment of the true purpose of every temple, which has been to be with God. The message of every temple will be fulfilled when God's people are in his presence, unobstructed with the Lamb in eternity. This is the fulfillment of every temple, and further, it's the fulfillment of all beauty. The beauty of each temple, whether inward or outward beauty, has always been to point us toward the most beautiful thing, the creator of beauty, and the thing that gives beauty meaning in the first place, God, the creator and redeemer. The temples were built to be beautiful for a reason. Solomon's temple was designed with imagery of God's creation to emphasize his presence for a reason. The beauty of the temples and the beauty of Jesus' sacrifice and victory, and the beauty of my brothers and sisters, of you and I as temples, all point to God for a reason. That's because all beauty points to God. And this might be a good overarching point to really encompass the whole lesson. God created beauty to be a reflection of himself, his beauty. When we see a beautiful sunset, it's a reflection of God's beauty. When we see beautiful landscapes or animals or beautiful things in nature, that's a reflection of the Creator and of his beauty. When we see beautiful people, this is a reflection of God's beauty because they were created in his image, and it's all meant to point toward him. And when we stop there, that's a mistake. Beyond natural beauty, when God created man in his image, if I understand it right, part of being created in God's image includes being created with the ability to create and recognize beauty. That's why we find such beauty in man-made things like basilicas and temples and music and designs and architecture. God has created us with the ability to recognize and create beauty. We're able to create beautiful things because God created beauty. And this isn't just true for outward beauty, it's also true for inward beauty. When we see kindness and mercy and patience and honesty, goodness, humility, they are also reflections of God's beauty. And you all have already acted very beautifully toward me. I've been able to meet a lot of you. Y'all have welcomed me in. Y'all have been extremely kind. I look forward to meeting the rest of you. And I've already gotten to experience that, and I'm sure you all experience that with each other all the time. All beauty we experience here points to God. The outward beauty of the temple was meant to show us that the real beauty of the temple was God. And one day the true purpose of every temple will be fulfilled when we who believe, we who have been made temples for a time, experience God's unobstructed presence in eternity. That is the beauty of God's temple. That is what all beauty points to. All beauty points toward God, the most beautiful thing and the creator of beauty. And if you'd like to experience that and become a Christian, and through grace become a temple of God's Spirit, so you can look forward to the presence of God in eternity, please step into an aisle, make your way to the front as we stand and as we sing.
I hear thy welcome voice that calls me, Lord, to thee. For cleansing in thy precious blood that flowed on Calvary. I am coming, Lord, coming now to thee. Washing, cleanse me in the blood that flowed on Calvary. 'Tis Jesus calls me on to perfect faith and love, to perfect hope and peace and trust, for earth and heaven above. I am coming, Lord, coming now to thee. Washing, cleanse me in the blood that flows on Calvary.
It has definitely been wonderful to be here today. What a blessing it has been. I want to welcome all of our visitors. If you have, if this is your first time with us and you haven't yet, please be sure to fill out a visitor card so we can have a record of your visit here with us. And we're definitely excited to have Micah working with us this summer. I know firsthand I've experienced his beauty. The 1st of April, he gave an invitation talk, and that turned into 4 baptisms that night. And what impressed me was we came up here, everyone had left, and we came back later that evening. And Micah and Josephine came all the way back out here. And it was beautiful. It really was. If you were unable to be here for our communion service this morning and you need to partake of the Lord's Supper, that is going to be offered now in the back room. You can go ahead and exit now and go to the back room on your left, and that will be served to you. And for those visitors, if someone has not collected your visitor card yet, at this time you can pass it into the aisleways, and in just a moment some young men will be coming down and they can collect those from you. We have collection boxes. We don't want to forget about those in between the exit doors in the back of the auditorium. If you haven't done so yet, you can drop your contribution there in those boxes. Group 4, just a few more announcements. Group 4 has a meeting in room 8 immediately after we leave here, after the closing prayer. So room 8, that is the high school class. Immediately after, that's group 4. And we are in need of 2 teachers for third quarter. That's next quarter, is coming up here in July. And that is for the cradle roll and the twaddler class. So if you can help out with that, the sign-up sheet is back there by the resource room, or you can get with Dave DeLugo and get yourself put down for those classes. And then the big thing.